All right, well, so here's what we'll do. We're going to spend about an hour today uh, talking about a subject that for me is a very important one and one that I like. It's called Tales the Tombstones Whisper. I get a great chance to do a lot of my work in old cemeteries, and I have had enormous help over the years from the cold case department at the Harford County Historical Society, Chris and Henry and Mary and Jim and many others. And you may even recognize that scene. That's up in northeastern Harford County, up at the Darlington Cemetery. Well, you know, when I take on a question, whether it's I need to put together some genealogy or family history, or I am looking at some other subject, a cemetery is one of the places I almost always end up. And I don't know about you, but even when I don't have to go there for some research that I'm doing, when we're traveling, we will often take a hike through a cemetery and get a good sense of the history that is all around us in an old place like that. Well, we're kind of going to unpack that really in our really fast time together of about an hour today. And we'll look at 3 or 4 subjects. We'll do a little bit of the history of the cemeteries, how they emerge, what they're like. We'll talk about the patterns and the changing practices and customs. And as we go through the material, we'll also talk about research techniques. I have a handout that I will send to Mary when we're done this afternoon, and then she can pass it out to you, because we're going to touch on a lot of subjects as we go. And Mary, it's okay if you see questions come in and we're talking about something, go ahead and interrupt, and let's take the questions as they come up, and I'll just keep an eye on the clock and make sure we come in on time, okay? All right, well, let's jump into this thing. Let's unpack it in the short amount of time that we have together today. Now, Maryland in the mid-Atlantic is going to be one of the most interesting places to do this kind of work. And it's simply because we have the full sweep of history. So in that full sweep, if we're talking about cemeteries and burial practices, often when I'm working, say, in an old house history or something like that, and I get around these old plantations that were at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and I get to poking around there, sometimes, just sometimes, I will find an old family burial ground. You see, our first burial practices, most often, the burials were somewhere nearby. Travel was too great. Churches were spread out at great distances, and you had to bury your family quickly. So you would find there was a lot somewhere on the property. Now that may have been lost to the passage of time, and you're looking at one here. A couple of years ago, a developer came and he says, you know, Mike, I think I found out in the woods these old tombstones from the 1830s and 40s and 50s. And I thought, oh, let's go take a look. And sure enough, right there in this dense woods that they were planning to turn into a housing development was the Henderson family burial ground. I don't think anybody visited, maybe except some occasional hunters, or maybe, I don't know, a teenager or something like that for decades. And mostly it had been lost to local history. Now, if you go down to Dorchester County, of course, our geography or topography has to drive this. Sometimes you just bury the family in the front yard. This is like along the coast there down just west of Blackwater in that area. This is a very common sight. You'll be driving those rural Dorchester County roads, and all at once, you see a tombstone in the front yard. Now, there was a reason for that. They did not have a lot of really dry, firm ground for burials. But that was not in coastal Maryland, or at least coastal Dorchester County. That was not an unusual practice. Well, soon enough and fairly fast, we're going to evolve from family plots plantation, on your property, on your acreage, and they overlay each other to some degree depending on where you were located, to the family, to the church. So this is at St. Francis Xavier. It's down on the Mason-Dixon line by the Sassafras River, an old Catholic institution. Now these are all over the place in Maryland. In this case, I am at St. Mary Ann's Episcopal Church in Northeast, and I certainly have gone down to the Harford County waterfront down at the top of the bay and visited some of the fine old churches there. They're all over the place, and this was mostly the way we're doing burials. You're now going to the churchyard, to the graveyard. This happens to be in Odessa, Droyer's Presbyterian Church. And so ahead of Christiana, just sort of all over the place. And I enjoy going out and looking for these. This is down in Cannon, Delaware. It's outside of Seaford. It's near the home of where Patty Cannon lived. Still, the state operates a ferry there. And right there is this old Methodist burial yard. Well, you know what? So from your family property, from the family acreage to the church burial ground, there's a movement comes in, and there's two elements of this movement. It starts in the cities, as it always would, and there was this idea that, well, maybe we should bury the dead separate from where we live and where we worship. It was also an era, the rural cemetery movement. It's an era of beautification. So like if you're in the cities and Wayne Schomburg does that grand walk in Baltimore, you can see these park-like cemeteries that were planted. Well, that type of movement where it's moving away from the churchyard, moving away from people, where it's a specific cemetery or a specific burial ground, slowly catches on about 1830. And then by the 1850s, business has caught up with it. In other words, we'll start having commercialization, which is a very new practice. Oh, you might say, look, I'd like to create a cemetery at the edge of town. Well, I'll go to outside the town on the hilltop, some available acreage. I'll follow that rural beautification movement that we're seeing modeled in the cities. And two of those images you're looking there actually are from Elkton, but these are all over the place. And I'll create a stockholder corporation. So at the edge of Elkton, this was in the 1880s, a little slower to arrive there, private investors go out and buy up acreage. Then, and it follows that practice of an organized, not a random burial cemetery like you can often see in the cemeteries where they use whatever space was available, and maybe there's not a lot of organization to it. Well, you were a stockholder, and you hired surveyors, you planted trees, there was landscaping, and this is a map of this one I'm talking about from 1880 something. And it was a park-like setting. It was designed to, people would want to visit, to be with their dearly departed. Now, these are all over the place. This is the big part of the movement. When you, hold on just a minute, stop. When you visit places like Gettysburg, no. When you visit places like Gettysburg, there's the Evergreen Cemetery. And let me do that. I was distracted with Cat. You still see this scene. Of course, this is from after the battle in Gettysburg. But if you like strolling old cemeteries, what a wonderful place to go stroll. And when you go up there, you will notice the Woman's Monument in Evergreen that opened in 1854. You see, Mrs. Thorne, Elizabeth Thorne, was the caretaker's wife. She actually lived there in that structure that we saw. Well, he was off fighting that hot July so long ago. And this terrible carnage has visited the city, has visited Gettysburg. Well, she grabs her shovel, even though she's expecting a baby, and she begins burying the dead because of this terrible, terrible carnage that has occurred there. The newspaper will carry ads because, you know, think of the heat of that summer and the tragedy that has come to that rural Pennsylvania crossroads borough. Will advertise for more people. Well, about 10, maybe 15 years ago, they decided they would honor Mrs. Thorne with that. Now, I mentioned that these are all over the place. Of course, doesn't every town need a useful cemetery? Well, this is not a spoof. This is Useful Cemetery in Useful, Kansas. And there's named after the town of Useful. That's Antietam, and it's always helpful when they put the date in there so my memory doesn't slip. It's 1883. Now these could be commercial enterprises that some communities would form nonprofits, and that the money the institution made, the organization, the enterprise made, was reinvested. You're actually over in the Delaware River. I kind of ramble around a large area, and one of the things I do is I keep a camera with me, and if the scenes are just right. So this is Port Penn, a really historic village on the Delaware River below Delaware City, and the conditions are right. And of course, this is one that your Darlington, Harford County's Darlington, always catches my attention because it's so attractive. There just happened to be a storm coming. It was 1882. Now, along the way, as you ramble about thinking about these places, that were somewhere in the 19th century, there also was the evolution of African American cemeteries, because we're in a segregated era. They could either be off to a corner of the cemetery, typically, or perhaps in their own. Well, this is just over the Mason-Dixon line. It's actually up by Lincoln University. It's Hosanna Church, as in Chester County's Hosanna Church. What I like about that one is when you walk that cemetery ground, there must be, I don't know, 12 tombstones there for United States colored troops, USCTs. I don't know if his clanging is bothering you, but I'm going to let him have it. There we go. It'll stop for 5 minutes, okay? And of course, so you think about these men who came up were growing up in a difficult time, volunteering to fight for the freedom. What you see at Darlington is the chapel. Rising Sun has one too, if you want to ever go over there and look at these. And often, depending on the cemetery, depending on the business enterprise, because that's the model we're into for a good stretch of time here, the caretaker would have a home. This is in Delaware, over by St. George's. And there's the caretaker's home. By the way, he still lives there. And Shakespeare picks up on it. He says, "Who builds stronger than a mason, a shipwright, or a carpenter? A grave maker. The house he makes lasts till doomsday." I had mentioned, and this is something I sometimes like to go off and look for, I had mentioned the United States colored troops. Well, they generally are regulation tombstones, and so they have this military federal look, and you can usually spot them because of their symmetry. And also I will look for the GAR post. So that's GAR post number 10 for Cyrus Wesley, who was in the 3rd United States Colored Troops. Sometimes it'll say infantry. I have found, like over in Salem County, New Jersey, United States Navy, but there's something to go look for. These are Confederate tombstones up by they're up by Chambersburg, out in that area in Western Maryland. Well, after the war, of course, we have need for a new category of a cemetery, the national cemeteries. So the government will begin the process of building our national cemeteries. And that begins in 1867 when we pass an act. And of course, there was the entire process of recovering the bodies. But about 300,000 Union troops are reburied with dignity and honor. They're dug up from places that they may have had shallow graves in, but now they will be put to a proper resting place. As you're ambling about the countryside, thinking about old burial grounds, if that catches your interest, there's another category we should mention, and that is the potter's field. You have yours up in back of the Hartford Mall, and now county, I guess the county parks department has it, but you see every county has one. It was called the Potter's Field. It comes out of the book of Matthew, and it was it was a quote in the Bible that says, "Bury him in the Potter's Field." Over on the left-hand side of your screen is Mike Martin, and it says Tramp. So at least they gave him a tombstone. A lot of times these folks, because they're the poor, the homeless, the social outcasts, mental illness, whatever it is for that particular time. And so the county and they're going to be buried in the county cemetery at county expense. Now, I like to go look for those, and because I do a lot of research around poorhouses and things like that. And I end up doing a lot of work in Delaware because I'm over on this side of that side of the state. I'm in Maryland, but just on that side. And this is a pretty typical situation of the rural farmhouses. That's down in Kent County, Delaware, by the way, not Maryland. Now you get up in Wilmington, of course, they had a big urban type of poorhouse, and that's it. But this would be more typical of the rural Maryland house. They could have looked like a very, very substantial farm. Often, in the case of poorhouses, those records have survived. I can access them sometimes at the state archives in Maryland. Virtually all of them, I think, the records are pretty extant. In Delaware, I have access to them. And the county historical societies have them. We'll have to ask Chris or Mary when I get finished here if they have them in Hartford, but I haven't looked at them. Cecil does have, and it's fairly complete collection. Well, times move on. These old cemeteries that we've been looking at, they're pretty high maintenance, grass cutting and trimming and all those things. Well, the McDonaldization, let's call it that, of cemeteries comes in, and we get the modern cemeteries. Tombstones have to be flat, regulation size, all that Victorian art, all of that personality is lost, and so you'll see these. That is what they do to use today. Now, when you go to a cemetery, one of the things you want to do is you want to pause and look at a whole bunch of things. There is so much history to learn. There is history about the community, family history, but there's a lot of messaging in these old tombstones. And much of it is fairly obvious. You'll see the age of the cemetery as it evolves through the build out, through the waves, and just take a look at this. This will give you an idea here of the range of them. Often in our older cemeteries, and we have a really strong collection of them here, it's just a piece of fieldstone. Sometimes the lettering, the chiseled markings have decayed, but somebody's just grabbed a piece of fieldstone because there are no commercial cemeteries, stonemakers yet at this point. And but later on, as we go into get ready to go into another century, or as we become more settled, you're going to see artwork, some form of creative work versus grabbing a piece of stone and chiseling a message. Later on, it takes on, especially as we move toward the middle of the 19th century, the Victorian age, you'll start seeing very specific artwork. So father and mother's graves, and the finger is pointing upward. But there's all sorts of artwork here that you can run into. It can be a broken tree indicating death came early. The one right here, if you can look and see where my mouse is pointing, that one actually was made by Tiffany's of New York. So no expense was spared in that. And of course, here's the modern version. This guy was the engineer on the on the Baltimore to Oxford train. Captain Gilligan was his name. And he died well before this was done, but some family member came back and had a laser touch applied to this. And, you know, these were expensive investments. But right there is your Tiffany studio. It's even copyrighted to be protected. The name on the tombstone was Roland. So there's a lot of messaging to be seen in these old cemeteries, from the quick pieces of wooden, just stone that have been grabbed, to religious symbolism. You will see occupational symbolism, fraternal clubs and their symbolism. When I get married to distribute the handout, I'll give you a list of some of the representations and what they mean. But here are a few more. So often children will have a little lamb or angel. This one I would say was vocational, though I had my students from the university with me one day, and they said, no, he's a communist. I said, no, I don't think that's what that means. I think he was a blacksmith, Mr. Cresswell. You can see his horseshoe up there and his working tools. Here's one. It looks like the hourglass has slipped by, and time has run out. This is a better picture. It's all the way over in Little Creek, Delaware. And I do this all the time. If I have time, I'll stop and just walk around and take a look and try to figure out some interesting things. So that's a pretty standard design if you are looking for troops, USCT or otherwise. So Mr. Thomas was in the 4th Delaware Infantry, and these are the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, sort of the era's VFWs, or veterans clubs. You'll see a few different sizes depending on where you are with the GAR, but they all look about like that, and they may have a little bit of symbolism. This is one of the most interesting places. I'm in Montpelier and Barre, Vermont. We go up there to vacation sometimes. And if you like old cemeteries, besides the fact that this was just a beautiful day here to catch this particular shot, there is no better place to walk. And I'll give you a couple more examples. But before I do, you know what? I think I call this one a genealogically friendly tombstone. Look at all the information. That's modern. There is Officer Ray from the Montpelier City Police Department, and eventually he worked as the first State House security officer. And he also had a Dairy Queen operator, and there's his wife. And they have these grand cemeteries, and I'll follow back up with that in just a minute. When you visit these New England cemeteries, this is more of the pattern that you will see. There is a distinct regional difference. Cultural, religion drives it. But you get up in New England in the colonial age, boy, they were closer to death, I guess, and they would represent it on their tombstones. So here's the skull, looking like on wings, flying off. Now these two look a little bit better, don't you think? Little happy angels, rather chubby little guys. And this one I kind of think of as like poor E.T. Call Home or something like that. He's looking a little sad, but there's the skull. So these are all up from our vacation trips up in New England. This is some combination. Angels and skulls and skeletons are what you will see there. Now, I really like to pause and read the messages on those. Let's do the one on the left first. What would you, in the world, would you suppose that means? It looks like they're expired. Archie A. Arnold, and his parking meters run out, so he's expired. But look at the one on the right. I'll have to read it for you because it's a little hard to make out. In memory of Charles H. Salmon, who was born September 10th, 1858. He grew, waxed strong, and developed into a noble son and a loving brother. He came to his death the 12th of October, 1884, by the hand of a careless drug clerk and two excited doctors at 12 o'clock at night in Kansas City. Well, I think they gave us the story. What do you think? And here's Thomas Thutcher of the Queen's Army. He came to his death from violent fever contracted by small beer, which was like drinking on a hot day. So it was very important to have these memorials. And practically every town of any size begins to have a monument maker as we get into the height of this age. And so you have the local monument makers. These guys are over in Port Deposit, but every town of any size is going to have them. Here's the one out of Wilmington. And after a loved one passed away, you would go to the monument maker and purchase a stone. He'd either order it for you, get the blank and chisel it in. Here's the reason I showed you this. This is an Episcopal church near Christiana Hospital, if you're familiar with that. Often I will look down at the bottom. So this is the same. I'm using my mouse cursor now to show you. This is the same tombstone here. But if you look down at the bottom, you see it says Thompson. Here's what that means. That's the monument maker that produced it. They would put their names on, just like Jones Junction. If you go there and buy a car this afternoon, you know how they put their little plate on there? So I'll look for those because I am interested in the occupation, the vocation, and the work. So next time you go, start looking for them. It's easy to miss. It's not prominent, just like your car dealership. Now, you didn't want to deal with your local monument maker. You could also order one from Sears. The Sears catalog had a good selection. I'll use these sometimes just to get a sense of pricing. Well, there was a case in 1927 where a woman had ordered medicine because her husband was seriously sick. Well, you know he died before it arrived. So she packaged it back up and sent it back to Sears for a refund. Sears, you know what? They had Amazon. They didn't call it Amazon, but Sears was their equivalent of Amazon. They didn't miss a beat, just like Amazon doesn't today. They package it up, sent it back, sent their condolences, and also sent her a special tombstone catalog. And so this is typical. Here's that monument from a local cemetery, and here it is in the catalog, and you can see the pricing of it along through there. Now you can get much fancier, and you can order out of the big distributor catalogs, or you can order the public monuments. Now I'm back up to Barre, Vermont, Montpelier. And the reason these guys had that, those communities had such large monuments and so many and such fine cemeteries is because they had large veins of granite there, and Italian craftsmen with fine skills would settle there and get jobs in those quarries and produce some of the nation's highest and most valued monuments. So like that's taller than I am. That's probably 7 feet high, 8 feet high. I'm something very big, much bigger than even a tall person typically. And look at the lifelike detail on that. Well, that's not an exception. That's more like the norm as you walk the cemeteries. So here's a child, and someone has so caringly, in a lifelike way of that person, that infant, made that. So again, these are all like as tall as people are. They're enormous monuments, and great detail has been put into them. And you know, there had to be a message. There was clearly a message. This is Mr. Donati. Take a look at that picture right there. He's smoking a cigar or a cigarette. And what do you see up through there? What I get out of it is look up in the smoke, and there's a woman in the smoke. You have to wonder what that message was. It's a better angle and a better picture of the same thing. And there's his fraternal group, and you'll see these fraternal markings, such as the Elks Club, along the way. This gentleman here, he worked for he was the city engineer in Montpelier, the water plant engineer. So he ran the water plant, and there he is with his pipe, a water pipe. Now, full of messages. Read these inscriptions, and certainly if they're your family history, you want to do that. So here's Charles and William Spitz. Charles died on August 10th, 1918, and William August 12th on the battlefields of France. It's good to photograph these and capture them. This is over in Bridgeton, New Jersey, and this is Joseph Brown. He was born in 1836, died in 1905, served in the U.S. Navy for the Union Army, once a slave and now free. The other thing to keep in mind is often cemeteries have been disrupted. And so, for instance, right now I'm over on the Mason, we are over on the Mason-Dixon line along the C&D Canal. And if you visit there, you can visit a place called Bethel Cemetery. It's still there, but there used to be a large Methodist house of worship. The problem for Bethel was that it was too close to the canal. And over the years from when the time the canal opened in 1829, the government always needed more land to make it bigger and bigger. And if you stroll that cemetery today, you'll see about 1,300 of these unknown tombstones. Here's what happened. The government last expanded the canal, make it 1,200. The government last expanded the canal in the mid-60s. And they let a contract for that final time with Sarton's Memorials over in St. George's, Delaware. And they said to Sarton's, you anticipate that you're going to move about 300 bodies. Well, they got into this plot because remember, there were probably in those earliest, and this was an old Methodist church, there were many people didn't have memorials, certainly not stone, and they've been lost either through decay like wood or not placed. They end up moving about 1,200 bodies there. So you can walk through there. While you're doing so, let me tell you about one additional person you might want to stop and pause and visit for a moment. This is President Clayton. Now, he was the president of the state of Delaware. He'd also been a Revolutionary War patriot, United States senator. And when Delaware figured out that they weren't going to have presidents and turned them into governors, everybody was starting to sort that sort of thing out. He became governor of the state. Well, he died on his farm outside of Middletown. His wife died a few years later, and he was buried on the farm. She insisted and gave instructions that she would not, because she was from Chesapeake City area, she wanted to be buried in Maryland soil. So they dug up President Clayton. They were comfortable, so they had one of the best spots in the cemetery overlooking the Sea of Deaconau. Along comes the government, and they say, we need that land. Well, they move him again. Some decades, generation later, along comes the government. We need that land. I think he's in his final resting place. At least I hope he's in his final resting place, because if they take it this time, they've really taken almost all of the cemetery. Now, that's not such an uncommon story. Often I'll get involved, like up in Wilmington, looking for old Catholic cemeteries. Well, they dug one up, reinterred the bodies to build one of the Delaware hospitals back in the 1920s or 30s. And of course, in doing that, a lot gets lost. You may see, as you look at the tombstones, you may see various representations of fraternal groups. These are tree trunks. If you belong to the International Order of Woodmen, you can have any kind of tree shape you want, as long as it's in their catalog, and they got several of them. And it wasn't like you had to be employed in the forestry industry. It was a fraternal group, was what it was. And so to look at these messages, this is the Showman's Rest in Woodlawn Cemetery, Forest Park outside of Chicago. And so, those guys travel on the train. They live a fairly itinerant life. And then when they die, one of the benefits they have is they can be buried in the Showman's Rest. One time, two trains plowed together. One was a circus train, and there are hundreds of people that burned to death in that train, and they are buried there. And by the way, you might want to stop by and see popcorn. Watch out for the snake popcorn. So you get a group of these. Now let me talk about epitaphs on the cemeteries. This is another one I would call genealogically friendly on our left. Here lies the body of William Christie, a native of Scotland and late merchant of Philadelphia, who was cut off in the flower of his youth by falling from the stagecoach near Cranberry on the 14th of October, 1796, and was killed on the spot. That's pretty helpful if we're doing genealogical work. This is more poetic. This was Senator Byron from Western Maryland, Captain U.S. Army, or member of U.S. Congress. On a beautiful, crisp Saturday, autumn day, he ran from this life into another on top of the world. You have to wonder what a lot of these things say. They certainly address the issue of family humor, what's going on in the family. This automobile, this was a 15-year-old that died suddenly. And he was so looking forward to driving, having his car that his father arranged for his car to be, his tombstone, to be made in an automobile format. Obviously, James, like the Three Stooges, laugh, don't weep. Now, this is not Edison, okay? This guy, Sal, he was an electrician in some place in New Jersey. There were manuals that told these rural monument makers how to format these things. And if you stopped in and were shopping, he would show you the suggested pattern. So like these are examples of how he might be able to list them. And it would recommend epitaphs for you if you, depending on how you, nobly he fell while fighting for liberty. So just a standard guidebook. Now there are a bunch of unique ones along the way. And let me read a couple to you here. Let me shuffle my papers. So these are a collection of unique ones. Maybe you, if anybody has one, when we take our break here in a few minutes, you might have a unique one you'd like to share. Sir John Strange, here lies an honest lawyer, and that is strange. Here lies Ezekiel Akel, age 102, the good die young. Here's Harry Edsel Smith of Albany, New York, born 1903, died 1942. Looked up the elevator shaft to see if the car was on its way down. It was. The grave of Ellen Shannon in Girard, Pennsylvania, who was fatally burned March 21st, 1870, by the explosion of a lamp filled with R.E. Danforth's non-explosive burning fluid. In a cemetery in Hartscombe, England, on the 22nd of June, Jonathan Fiddle went out of tune. Let's see what else we got here. Someone determined to be anonymous. Stowe, Vermont. I was somebody who is no business of yours. Jonathan Grower, died dead sober, Lord, thy wonders never cease. Here, beneath the stone, our baby lies. He neither cries nor hollers. He lived on earth just 20 days and cost us $40. Thurmont, Maryland. Here lies an atheist, all dressed up and no place to go. So anyway, you can find a great deal. I have a bunch more. These are out of the book. They're probably not as creative, but I go look for these. Now this is up at Darlington. This is a memorial for Maud Bedford. She was killed at Edgewood Arsenal toward the end of the war. And if you go up there today, these 3 little mortar shells line up the area with the flag, and there's a little memorial plaque on the tombstone. You have to wonder, too, about the humor. Take a look at this one. See, I told you I was sick. Well, somebody's got a sense of humor, right, with these types of things. But just as interesting for me, although those are fascinating, are the messages and what they mean. These young ladies died not far apart after surviving one of these devastating floods in Port Deposit where the ice comes barreling in, and they had to be rescued out of there by boat. What do we got here? We've got March 5th, 1857, which is about 4 years old. Yeah, a little. And then we've got March, 3 days later, March 8th, 1857, 2-year-old. Well, you know, I can put that material, I can go to the obituaries and pull that material together and get the death certificates if we're into that period. Or a message like this. Every one of these old stones has a message or something that might, that definitely is often worth looking into. And the spatial arrangement is something I will look at, like the build out of the waves and the age, or the placement of people. I was down in All Saints. It's an Episcopal church, and in the very lower end of Snow Hill, down the lower end of the eastern shore. And I was doing an interview with a television station. And all the way in the back there was this one monument, way distant from anything else. And she asked me about it. And I said, well, I don't know. Let's walk over. He was a Union soldier. He was the first Union soldier to die after troops occupied Snow Hill. He died from a disease. He didn't die from, any violence or anything like that. And the good people of All Saints in Snow Hill, they were going to bury him, but they didn't put him in the prime territory. And here's Handy Hudson. He was their family slave. So he got a cherished spot. Now, one of the problems we're running into is that so many of these stones, not as bad as this one, this was a soft sandstone, so they're fading quickly. But notice when you go, so we're fortunate for groups like the DAR and other groups that went generations ago before so much fading occurred. Now, let me see here where we are in time. At the same time this is going on, the cemetery industry or the undertaking business needs to evolve. You see, before almost the very end of the 19th century, the undertaker was a cabinet maker. And you went and you bought your coffin. Well, you might buy a new dining room table while you're there. It was the skill of a craftsman. And some of them would evolve to help direct affairs. But here's what changes this greatly and brings about the modern format, although the modern style is changing, was the Civil War. That's the Antietam on your right. For the first time, people will leave home and go off to fight in bloody, bloody battles. And a good number of them are not going to return home. Here you see United States colored troops recovering bodies that were hastily buried following the war so they can have a dignified burial in a national cemetery. Well, the government was not responsible for returning the body. The best you got was a hasty burial if the situation permitted. So again, enterprise stepped in and filled the void. And what did we have? We had embalming surgeons. So just like Matthew Brady would follow the army to the next conflict, these embalming surgeons, who are private contractors, are following the army. These are two pictures of them. And you might say to your friend, Joe, if I fall in the battle, make sure the embalming surgeon embalms my body and ships me back home to, say, Harford County, because it's going to take a period of time. And before this, you were just hastily buried. Maybe ice was used as a preservative to give them a little bit more time. But the embalming surgeon would allow these soldiers to be embalmed and to be sent back home following a battle. I ran into this gentleman up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He was a reenactor, and he reenacted doing the embalmings. And you could either make pre-arrangements, arrange for your buddy to take care of it, but it's causing the nation to become aware of embalming and that bodies can be preserved. And then what happens, we have that dark April of 1865, where President Lincoln is shot, and that funeral train begins that long, slow journey back home to Springfield, Illinois. Well, if you look at the receipts from the funeral homes and the undertakers, you'll begin seeing a change in the services they provide. Some of these would list ice, but in short time, you're going to see preserving the body, and they charge $7. You see, he's an undertaker up in Oxford, Pennsylvania. And an embalmer. He charges $70 for that funeral in 1917. It cost, $92 or $93. Well, that catches on. Across the country, people begin becoming morticians, funeral directors. They pick up on this embalming surgeon, and they move away from being cabinet dealers. And there were all sorts of patents and things that were developed and invented. And this, let me comment on that. This was one where a person was worried about being buried alive. They arranged, it had a little bell you could jingle if you woke up and you were 6 feet under. you could jingle a bell, somebody's invention to to deal with that issue. Now, what happens that really creates the era that most of us know for cemeteries is a trade association. The National Funeral Directors Association was formed. And then mortuary schools were formed. Don't you just love getting a Christmas card wishing you a Merry Christmas from your local mortuary school? What happened to get these started was it was really private enterprise. Professor Joseph Clark will establish the first embalming school in Cincinnati. Well, you know what he was? He was really a chemist, a manufacturer of chemicals. And he decided this is a great way to sell chemicals and supplies, formaldehyde basically. And so he would formulate this up. He would send his detail men, his traveling salesmen, and they would go visit, say, Havre de Grace or Bel Air, and they'd talk to the local undertaker, cabinet maker, and say, you know, this is a great way to expand your business. You can now embalm, and you can charge more, and you can become a funeral director. The National Funeral Directors Association, of course, they're trying to promulgate or push for advanced advanced business practices, and it evolves. And by the 20th century, that's pretty well the way things are done. You can find in the local historical societies, you can find all sorts of advertising cards and receipts in the Victorian era trade cards from these people. I'll often go look for them. When I'm looking for deaths, this is a coroner certificate for a drowning on Watson's Island. Sometimes I'll go looking for those because you can't find those sorts of things. And you see here on May 29th, 1827, a stranger came by his death by the visitation of God by drowning. So what that meant was they had looked at it. It wasn't a murder. They couldn't they didn't believe it to be violence. And so the determination was it was a natural cause. Well, life expectancy goes up in this period. From in 1850, we were, I'll say 37 years was something like the life expectancy. During the Spanish flu, it actually takes a 12-year drop. And in 2000, what are we, around 75 or 76? There are all sorts of ways to come up with these obituaries through the newspapers and the historical societies, the digitized newspapers, the death certificates. Chris Smithson's been a lot of help to me in Harford County whenever I have been doing those things. And of course, there are things like family Bibles that give you that sort of information. Well, the 20th century goes on. We've got these undertakers all over the place, and every community has one. For me, part of the fun is doing research on this. And so this gentleman here is a retired federal agent. One day he came into the office and said, you know, Mike, I'm a federal agent. I thought, oh goodness, what are we, what do we do to deserve this business? But he explained. He says, you know, that pocket watch I'm holding in my hand there belonged to my great-great-grandfather, George Askew. And we were cleaning out my grandmother's house, and we'd always heard, and it was up in the attic. She put it there for safekeeping. We'd always heard that he died in a railroad accident in Iron Hill, but, you know, she didn't talk about it. Well, think of that. Death comes suddenly for this young family. There's Mr. Askew up there, and he leaves for a run to Philadelphia from Baltimore, going to be back that night, and he does not return. He says, you think you could help me put that story together? I said, yeah, you know, railroad accident. Yeah, I think we can figure that out really, really fast. So we pulled up the coroner's reports. And sure enough, there it was. That was a little more tragic than, you know, every death being tragic, but this was a difficult death. He was on a train run across the state line into Delaware, and the engine was acting up, and it was extremely stormy, heavy rain, torrential rain, and he had stuck his head out to try to see if he could see what was going on. and he came to one of the narrow railroad bridges, and he was decapitated on the spot. The fireman said, all I heard was a thud, and I turned around, and the engineer rescue was gone. Well, they don't find the body for about 6 months, and when we finally got the coroner's report and could see the details, what they said was they identified him from a pocket watch. It said his hands was a railroad watch, and its hands were frozen in time permanently at 8:35, the time of the accident. Well, of course, this was new to this gentleman. Then we pulled up the newspaper since we had a date. So we got a lot of information out of that. Cemeteries are a great place to do this type of research. Of course, there are other types of death records that you can use. This was assigned in a cemetery. I didn't knock on his door to ask for genealogy information. He apparently was not open to visitors and to be bothered by such, but most are very helpful and glad to help us. And often, even better, they're in the custody of a local historical society, which is one of the places I will go to do my research. Maryland is just starting to digitize their death certificates. And they've got about 12 years on something like that. So that's going to be really helpful for all of us as they create digital access. But you know what? It's another way for you to approach your research. Photograph the tombstones, record the information. It gives you another perspective. And it's not to say there will be mistakes in that stone, because I have found a few, but it is just one more way for me to triangulate your information. This group here is a good group to get to know, and you can Google them up, and I'll include them in the reference list that I send Mary. It's the Coalition to Protect Maryland Burial Sites. It's an advocacy group and information. They run an annual seminar. I try to go to them sometimes, and they have very helpful information. This guide here, the Guide to Cemetery Research, it'll be in your handout. It's an excellent guide if you want to really drill down into any of these subjects. But there's no better way, let me just see where we are here. There is no better way to get to know, one of the best ways to get to know family history is by visiting these old cemeteries and seeing them. I'm going to stop screen sharing now, Mary, and come back up, okay?
Okay, we have a question from Chris Smithson. With regards to cemeteries and epidemics, is there a list of epidemics that hit the Mid-Atlantic region during the 18th and 19th century?
There are, Chris, and there were several. Of course, the early 20th century one, the Spanish flu, is the biggest one. And Harford County was really, really staggered by that because you had the government bases there. And they put a quarantine zone specifically around Edgewood and Aberdeen, and your numbers are like higher than most places. But back into the 19th century, there are, and I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll put a website on your handout list that'll give you the other epidemics. Chris, let me ask Chris a question, or Mary, either of you answer this. Do you have the almshouse records, poorhouse records for Harford County?
Yes.
So you would be the place to go to. Don't overlook, folks, don't overlook those records. A lot of times when I'm helping somebody to try to break down a brick wall, the person's grown elderly and is a surviving female, and that was our system of social welfare. And I'll break down brick walls in there when the other methods have failed. All right, Mary, you said you had another one?
Yes, it's from an anonymous attendee. He just had trouble seeing your slides on the screen.
Oh, he said he had trouble seeing this. Were you seeing the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
I know this is being recorded. I don't know when it'll be available for review.
Yeah. Anybody have a tombstone story that they could tell us, or an epitaph or anything like that?
They're muted, but if they type it in, I'll read it.
Okay. Are we okay? We're about where we want to be in time, right, Mary?
Yes.
Yeah, and Mary, if I send you the handout, you can get that to them, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
You
I'll
should
send
have
that to you.
received a class list too.
Okay, I'll pull that together, and I'll include the. I'm going to include a couple of the books and things that are of interest. All right, Mary, I think that's got it.